Before I start the actual illustration, I'm going to go over all the various tools I'm using. I do the initial breakdown for the illustration on my Samsung Galaxy Tab 6 Lite tablet. This is the 2019 edition. Picked it up in 2020. This is, as of shooting right now in 2024, it's been working incredibly well. I will eventually be upgrading to a later Samsung tablet in the next year or two, but I've been extremely happy with this. Once I get that basic illustration down, so I finish the concept, I then want to redraw it on Strathmore Bristol 11 by 17. This tends to be the size I work at most often, and I'll do comic pages at usually. This is smooth surface, 100-pound weight, and the initial layout will be done with the 2H Staedtler pencil. I will not be showing too much of that portion on the video, mostly because it's just far too light to be picked up by the camera. Once the layout's done, however, then I switch over to working with Speedball Super Black ink and using my Speedball lettering pens, actually, and a couple of brushes. This is for doing backgrounds, doing the outline of the major characters. For the interior of the major characters, where I want a little bit more control, a little bit tighter detail, I'll actually switch over to Faber-Castell Pitt pens. Sometimes I'll use a Crow Quill pen as well with the super black ink, but for this particular project, I was using the Pitt pens. Then, when I have all the primary inking done, but I want to put in white highlights and a few other effects, probably possibly change a few things, I'll grab the Dr. P.H. Martin's Bombay white ink and another dedicated Speedball lettering pen to do all that work. Once all that's completed, this then gets scanned. I actually scan the image at 1200 DPI at full size. I like making super, super high scanning, but then I'll drop it down to 600 DPI for the actual painting. That painting is done on my PC using a Huion Kamvas Pro 2.5K screen tablet. I've had this for a couple of years. Very, very happy with this. This is obviously not a touch tablet. Nothing happens when I'm putting my hand directly onto the tablet screen here. You do all the work with the stylus. This is all being done in Photoshop. And again, the color piece is being done at 600 DPI RGB full size. So this is also at 11 by 17. Let's talk about this Guitarist In The Tower illustration breakdown. So the initial sketch is being done on, as I'd said earlier in the video, my Galaxy Tab 6 Lite tablet. I also have a stack of old sketch pads, and not even old ones. I still use them quite often. But when doing a brand new piece like this, working on an 11 by 17 piece, I found I tend to really like doing my initial layout on a tablet. Just normally I'm doing it like, sitting somewhere else and sketching roughly. This one I did on my in my normal drawing area, normal studio area for the video. But using it pretty much the same way I would use any of the simpler, any of my older sketch pads. Just gives me a little bit more freedom for playing with ideas. In this case, figuring out the basic composition, starting with the main figure and the guitar that she's holding. This is actually going to be something to contrast with later in the illustration when I get to working on the inking, when I get to working on the coloring. When I create the initial composition, I do tend to start with the main character, whatever the focus of the illustration is. So in this case, the guitarist herself, figuring out the pose, figuring out how she's holding the guitar in this instance. For instance, one of the things, when I first came up with the idea, I wasn't sure what the guitar was actually going to be sitting on as she was holding it. As it progresses, I realized that actually I'll have the guitar sitting on her amp, or Marshall amp or something. But chiefly, I wanted to figure out her rough pose, which is actually being based on a photo I had taken of one of the models that I work with, where she's leaning up against a railing, and I knew the overall setting would be in this futuristic arcology style building that I've been playing with for a book project I'm working on right now, as well as a game of Cyberpunk Cyberpunk Red. There's so many iterations of the Cyberpunk game. A complex that I created for here in Winnipeg. The piece I'm working on, that I'm currently sketching, actually, that particular element is this giant statue in this large facility, in this large arcology. It's made up of these segments that each are about 10 stories tall, and in the center of each one of these segments, around this, in this kind of atrium area, are these very large statues. And I had come up with this one particular idea of a very stylized tengu, a style of a particular type of Japanese spirit or demon, yokai. But a very stylized, very Winnipeg, very cyberpunk version of it. Like a corporatized version of one of these characters. That was going to be the basic setting. The fact is, my idea was the guitarist is standing on one of these levels within one of these large segments, facing away from the central atrium. So she's leaning on a railing that is surrounding this atrium, kind of like a very large mall. Behind her would be this large statue that started 2 or 3 stories below her and goes up quite a bit higher above her. And right now you can see that I'm actually creating, sketching out ideas for the various other levels within these 10-story segments. And now working out the rough shape of the guitar. Pretty quickly I decided I actually don't like this shape for the body of the guitar. But I'm still just doing the very rough figure placement and placement of all the various ideas. So just leave with this. I just start with this kind of Fender, very stylized version of a Fender guitar. It will get changed quite a bit later on in the illustration, though. So after doing the super quick breakdown of the primary elements in the illustration, the guitarist herself, the guitar, whatever the guitar is sitting on, the railing she's leaning against, the statue behind her, and then other railings or other elements that are indicating the various stories in this atrium. Using the tablet, moved all of that stuff onto a separate layer, dropped down the opacity a little bit, and now I'm sketching over top of that. Again, still playing with the very curvy lines on that guitar that I will end up changing to a bit more something that you'd be seeing being used by the lead singer of the 80s band Missing Persons later on. But right now, all right, I've roughed in the basic shape. Let's do another lighter pass, a slightly darker one, but this still won't be anywhere near the final version, where I'm picking out some secondary elements. What does her jacket actually look like? What does her shirt actually look like? Various things like that. Anytime I need to move an arm, move another element, I tend to draw, whenever I'm working on these poster type images, each one of these things tends to get drawn at least 3 times. There's the initial super quick layout, then another rougher one over top of that, but a little bit darker, and then what would be the third final version. If I was just doing a pencil illustration, in this case, I'm taking a lot of that kind of idea of drawing, the idea that drawing is redrawing, playing with all that in the tablet, so that I can easily, trace the image over top of itself, see where I don't like, various arm placements, where the figure is in that composition, and then I still get to tinker with it afterwards. Again, much the same as if I was using a sketchbook. When you look at any of my initial sketches, you'll be seeing areas where I've drawn over it repeatedly. And I will draw the first pass when I'm working with just a pencil doing the initial sketch. It's done super light. I tend to have a very, very light hand when I'm working with pencil, and then build it up as I go along. Unless, and actually this is something that'll come up later when I do a video on an illustration where the pencils will be the final version. I don't tend to use erasers a whole heck of a lot, unless the eraser is for a particular effect. If you take a look at some of my pencil illustrations that I've posted on my website and such, there are things like snowfall or certain lighting effects where, in those instances, I'll have put those in with an eraser. But for the most part, I tend to not do a lot of erasing. Rather than doing that, I'll just build up layers with the pencil. And that's kind of what I'm doing here, where I'm just going over the same lines a little bit more darkly, a little bit darker lines, figuring out the placement of the various belts and whatnot. But you get to do it all digitally. This S Pen that I'm using with the Samsung tablet is fantastic. It's one of the nicest, I want to say styli, one of the nicest styluses I've ever used. A little bit limited for some things. In fact, the tablet itself, I haven't done a whole lot of painting with this particular tablet. I much prefer using Photoshop on my computer to do any digital painting rather than anything with the Samsung tablet. But the tablet's fantastic for doing sketching, for playing with ideas. I've done a little bit of painting with it. I do like what I can come up with. But I've been using Photoshop professionally since 1997. So if we're going to talk about any sort of illustration program that I'm comfortable with, that is the one I'm far and away the most comfortable with, and that kind of interface. So already you can see now I'm starting to change up that design of the guitar. So I'm losing the more old school Fender style body, that wavier body, and now going for something with a bit more harsh angles. Again, very 80s new wave. A lot of the imagery in this piece, like a lot of the imagery that I do in all of my cyberpunk pieces, is very much based on 80s iconography. Cyberpunk really is, as far as the way that I deal with it, it is the future of the 1980s. If everything that was happening in the 80s kept going in that direction. So much so that when I do any sort of story set in a cyberpunk universe, that people do have cell phones. I always have to think about it. It always feels a little bit weird. Because that didn't really start until the late 80s. Well, people didn't really start using media until the 90s. They technically did exist in the very late 80s, but were incredibly rare. So the new design is now laid down for the guitar. A little bit closer to what I'm thinking of. It still has a headstock. I had been thinking of not using one where the strings are just basically clipped at the very, very top, because that is the style I've seen with 80 style electric guitars. But I still wanted to make it a little bit more identifiable as an electric guitar. So now zooming in, working on a bit more tight detail. Now, this is an awful lot of work to be doing on something that won't be used. Aside from being in this video and, you know, on Instagram stories or whatever social media thing I put it on, I'll put it on as a work in progress. For the most part, the sketching I do in with a tablet winds up only just being that, just, you know, conceptual sketches. This is all me just breaking down the ideas. So then when I go to do the final version, which I'm doing on paper, it just gives me a really good idea of how I want the final piece to look. But now that I'm putting in more intense detail, like actually adding in the center of the eye, adding in eyelashes, the eye, putting more of an emphasis on the eyebrow to create a bit more emotion. I'll start actually laying out some lines that'll indicate the direction of light. It's a big thing that'll be very prominent later on in the illustration. But yeah, I'll still do a lot of detail, even though this detail is really just for me. When I do the final version, it still helps me in the creative process to figure out, you know, what it is that I'm wanting to do. Figure out, do I want the chin to be quite this large? I did eventually end up pulling back on that when I switched over to working on paper. And here's where I first start indicating the actual light source. The fact that I want to kind of a strong light coming from the left of frame, from her right. So I add this Terminator line on her chin and on her cheek to give a much stronger sense of, all right, make sure that everything I want to emphasize will be on that side of the figure, or at least visible from a light source on that side of the figure, so it doesn't get dropped into shadow too much. And yeah, just continue building up slowly the overall leather jacket design, the shirt design, all these smaller elements on the figure, all of which will still be in flux until, you know, I'm actually working with ink on the final image. And even then, because I'll be working with some white ink, that's still subject to change. But I'm basically trying to make all of the decision-making part of the process, trying to finish all of that here, so that when I switch over to working on paper, it's less about figuring out, oh, is there, you know, does she have a sports bra under the shirt, which I've just added in a bit of a hint about, or where's the light source coming from, and I can concentrate on how do I best indicate that light source. How do I best make sure that stays consistent? And the fact that the primary direction of light on her will be different than the primary direction of light falling on the statue behind her. If I make those sorts of decisions now, then later on when I'm working on the more finished piece, there are fewer things will end up going wrong. There are a few things that I will be forgetting about. I want to make sure that anything I'd initially come up with, unless I decide at the last minute to completely change it, will still be consistent with my original idea. And they didn't just end up being just falling by the wayside. Those decisions. And changing the style of sleeves on her jacket. So not only are they pushed up, they're actually buttoned into a higher position. Again, kind of going with an 80s look, a bit of a Miami Vice look to the jackets with pushed up sleeves, and adding a bit more detail into that Marshall amp. The aspect ratio on this illustration isn't quite the same as it is on the when I switch over to working with pencil and ink. That'll again will be an 11 by 17 image. This doesn't quite fall into that aspect ratio. It's close, but there'll actually end up being a little bit more space below her, so I can add a little bit more detail onto the amp that the guitar is sitting on. But it's still getting me the basic idea. And now we're into deciding what that railing looks like that she's leaning against. Pretty quickly, I realized that it is an open railing, but I want to have something still physically between her and between the statue behind her. So the metal crossbars are actually holding sheets of glass, and that'll end up getting affected quite a bit in the coloring process. But around here is when I realize that that's what I want to do. So I can be playing with multiple textures. That's another thing that I'm having to decide at the moment. How do I best figure out the textures of the various things? How am I going to represent that? Now, at this point, I figured out the basic line art on the figure, the guitar, and that railing. So I'm adding in a bit of shading. This is just for me to remember the direction of light and how it's going to be interacting with all these elements. Because I'm going to be doing this as an ink illustration that will then be digitally colored, a lot of this shading won't necessarily be represented in the inks. Quite a bit of that I'll be leaving open, except, well, in the hair, it'll be mostly black ink, but a lot of the details on her shirt, on the skin itself, on the guitar, will actually be left as fairly left wide open to interpret later with coloring. But I want to make sure that that I don't forget the direction that light is going to be coming from, at least the primary light source. There are some secondary and tertiary light sources I'll be dealing with. Mostly dealing with different color. Eventually, with a lot of these pieces, and again, if you look at some of my earlier cyberpunk work from the last few years, I actually had a phase where all of it was, or almost all of it was done with very strong red and blue light sources. Periodically, there are a few that have a tertiary one where it's a green light source, usually giving it a bit more of a creepy vibe. But with the red and blue, it would always be very clear the red was coming from one direction, the blue was coming from a different direction. Sometimes those those light colors would be reflected back, so you would get a spot of red in the middle of a giant blue area because it had been reflected by another reflective surface. But for the most part, you'd have red either from the top or from one particular side, and then blue coming from the other. I'm doing that. My intent when I started this was to do it here as well. Not quite to the same strength as the red-blue illustrations, because I do have a bunch of other color tones in this. The skin tones on her will still remain more or less the same as what her skin tones would be under regular light. You know, if she was just outdoors on a regular sunny day, perhaps a bit darker, but they'll definitely be influenced by a bit of that red light. It's actually more in the background that we'll be dealing with the stronger blue light source and then the red light source as part of a way to separate her from the environment a bit, to create a bit of extra depth. And we're actually getting into the depth portion quite a bit after the inks are done, because of the way that I'll be doing the background. But now I'm getting into doing my second sketching pass on the statue, the Tengu design in the background. And when I first come up with the idea of using this highly stylized Tengu design as statuary inside this tower, which in the story I'm working on and in the game I'm working on is referred to as Tengu Towers. I had just was working with this, this bird motif for as though it was a bird helmet on top of the statue. But I kept extending the beak on that design to look, I was inspired by a variety of influences. But eventually I came to realize in a very Winnipeg moment that it was really representing the face mask of the Phantom from the movie Phantom of the Paradise, a notorious film from the 70s, which was popular pretty much only in Winnipeg when it was first released. But we're not going to get too far into that. I actually do have one Phantom illustration done. I did in October of 2023. Only ever did as an ink illustration. I have not done a color version of it, which can be found on my Instagram page, and I believe I even have it up. Oh no, I don't have it on my Redbubble. I don't have anything on my Redbubble site that's any intellectual property owned by other people. So no, that wouldn't be up there. But if you went through my Instagram, I think I even did a short video here on YouTube for that. But anyway, so now I've roughed in the basic design, nailed it down a bit more like is the way I like it. And I'm also dealing with the shading on that statue the same way I did on the main figure. And you'll see pretty quickly that the lighting pattern, the primary direction of light falling on that statue, is different than on the main figure. I didn't want to have them consistent because the guitarist is so far forward in space. That statue is giant. That statue is probably 7 or 8 stories tall. So it would have to be a fair bit behind her in order to be able to see that much of it. And to reinforce that, it has completely different light sources on it. So none of the light that's reflecting on the main character will be represented on that statue because it's just nowhere near it. And I'll be dealing with, again, getting to later into color theory and such. The background will be much bluer and the foreground will be much redder. Basically dealing with warm and cool tones to help separate the various layers, the various planes in this illustration. On that subject, there are basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 planes in this illustration. The main figure and the guitar and the amp that it sits on are all furthest forward. They're the closest to the viewer. The railing is it's close, but it is just a little bit behind that. So I would call it a second plane. The third would be 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4 planes. So the third one would be the statue. And then further behind that is the back wall, all the detail, the other layers in the interior structure of this atrium. And I want to be able to separate those various layers. Typically, when you're working with color, the easiest way to do that is with both the color temperature and the saturation. So color temperature, cool colors, blues typically, and those tend to be further away from the viewer. Warm colors, reds, oranges, things like that, tend to be closer. Also, if if there's more of a color, it's more saturated, that tends to be closer to the viewer. Something where the color is less saturated, where there's less of that color, that tends to be further away. So if you were to look at a simple color illustration of a landscape, the sky is pale blue off in the distance. In the foreground, that's where you would have the much warmer tree trunks, even greens with a lot of orange or yellow light. Those would just automatically feel like they were closer to the viewer. And a lot of that is that's how we associate colors in the real world. So I'll very much be playing with that in this particular illustration. Now that I've laid out the basic idea for these various layers, just quickly adding in a little bit more depth to some of the shading, again reinforcing the direction of color, the direction of light that I'll be playing with, both on the main figure and then on the statue behind her. There will be some light coming up from below on that statue, but for the most part, the light interacting on the statue will be coming from above and surrounding it. There'll actually be a few light sources directly on that back wall. And here we have basically the finished the finished sketch. Now I'm switching over to working on the Strathmore pad, so 11 by 17. Like I said in the earlier part of the video, this pad is 11 by 17 Strathmore Bristol paper, 100 pound, and doing the basic layout with a 2H Staedtler pencil. I'm not going to show too much of this part because, as you can see, it's incredibly light. You can barely see it on camera. And I like working that way with the pencil portion. It makes it much easier to change things as I go along. I don't like doing a whole lot of erasing. One reason why I don't like doing a lot of erasing on physical media is that it can actually physically damage the paper. That will make it much more difficult. Not so much when you're working with pencil, when you're working with just pencil, but when you go later on to ink anything, if the surface of the paper is damaged, ink will interact with it differently. So we're just cutting through a few sections of this, like right now detailing some of the guitar, using very slow, deliberate strokes of the pencil to figure out the basic shape. I'm also roughly working from the upper left to the bottom right. Now, this won't be consistent because I still haven't dropped in anything with the background. But just like when I did the first breakdown, I'm concentrating on the figure first and then working into the background. Now I have a much more solid idea of the composition. It's now easier to play around and add things, define certain things that I want to have picked out more, change things around from the original design. As you can see, the bottom of the guitar is, this is not really a playable guitar. If you look at the bottom of that guitar, it's too long. It would end up being, there's no place for you to actually play it. Or the actual playable area is a very small part of that. But in this case, I'm going over with the particular style, and I just kind of like that the sort of carapace going over top the bottom of the guitar. It created a really interesting look. And as I mentioned earlier, that I went ahead and added more detail below the guitar. I'm also getting to add in the straps coming off of the back of the guitar, draping over this amplifier that it's sitting on, or that she has it leaning on. So things like that. This is one of the nice things about when I'm drawing it multiple times. So I get to, I now have an opportunity to fix things, change things, punch them up a little bit, remove elements I don't think that are working as well. But in this case, it's mostly just doing this outline, not worrying about overworking anything right now. This can be an issue with doing pencil illustrations, with doing all illustrations, in fact. If you, when you're still at this stage, where you're putting together the composition, you can run into the problem where you start adding too much detail and you spend so much time working on this small element and you go to the next piece. So if I was working on her hand, if I'd spent too much time working on that, then went to the neck of the guitar, spent too much time working on that, each part individually might look nice, But as soon as you sort of zoom out and look at the whole thing, you realize they're not to the proper scale. Her hand might be too small compared to the rest of her body. The body of the guitar might be too large because I wasn't paying attention to the overall composition. So doing this sort of methodical approach where I'm doing the illustration in stages, at any point, if I realize, oh, that arm is too long, or that leg is too short, anything like that, I've got plenty of opportunity to fix that. Once I'm at the inking stage, I want to make sure that any sort of anatomical issues have been dealt with, any issues of scale, of relation of items in space are all taken care of. So now we're into the inking portion. The entire background had been roughed in, and I am outlining the main figure in pieces, but here's where the overall approach will change radically. Creating the initial composition, I worked from the front to the back. I started with the most important elements in the illustration. So the main figure, the railing, the guitar, and then I went to the statue, and then finally to the deep background to create the setting she's in. But now that I have the basic idea done, I figured out, yep, that statue's supposed to have 4 arms, not 2. This is where everything sits in place. This is how large all these elements are supposed to be in relation to each other. I'm going to quickly outline a few of them, but then I'm going to start working on the deep background. When I'm working on the inking section, and then later on when I go to the coloring, I tend to work from back to front. At this point, I'm preferring to create the setting that the character exists in, because I've already made all the major decisions regarding the main character. But now I need to concentrate on where they exist. And this is something actually I noticed I was doing quite a bit different than what a lot of other artists were doing when I was spending a lot of time doing Twitch streams. I do notice that a large majority of artists on Twitch focus on the main character and spend very little, if any, time on backgrounds. They're not really worried about creating the setting that their characters inhabit. They're just working on the characters. And first off, I just love playing with negative space. I love creating the world that these characters inhabit. Once in a while, I'll do something that doesn't have a background, like the opening image of this video. But that's rare. I tend to prefer to not just show the figure, not just show the person or a particular interaction between a couple of people, but I like to show where they exist. Not just the light falling on them, but where that light comes from, or at least imply where it comes from. So at this point, I'm starting to put in a fair amount of detail onto this into this background atrium. Now you notice I've got these sort of hanging, almost hanging scrolls. This would be because certainly in the real world, there'd be a lot of advertising in a mallplex or something like that. In a cyberpunk setting, it's even more prevalent, and I definitely will be leaning into that with this upcoming story that I'm working on. This piece it's partially a standalone piece, but it's also partially helping me develop this particular setting. When if I was to do this image again as part of the story itself, I would be leaving those large blank areas that I would then later fill in with a lot of advertising. I'm actually working on a series of illustrations as part of this story that I'm developing that will be dropped in specifically to those large sections of advertising. So now I have that upper left-hand section mostly drawn in, outlining, continuing to outline both the main character and that statue so that I can start working even more on the background. And this is where I'm really also leaning into starting in the upper left-hand corner of the illustration and then going to the bottom right. Part of it, frankly, is just so that I am not accidentally dragging ink. I'm not having my hand fall into any wet ink and drag it across the surface of the paper. I know a lot of people don't like working with ink, and they really don't like working with speedball pens or brushes because of that, because it's so easy to make a mess, basically. I know there are quite a few people that will work entirely with pit pens and other. When I was first learning inking back in the 80s, there was a lot of criticism about how the approach that a lot of people had with regard to inking, because they were using what are called technical pens. For the most part, markers and things like pit pens didn't really exist. Instead, you had these technical pens that you had to constantly refill that were seen as being much easier to use. The downside is you would lose a lot of character to the lines. If you had a 0.01 millimeter nib, it never created a line wider than 0.01 millimeters. If you wanted to make that line wider, you either switched to a different pen or you just drew more lines. You just kept thickening and thickening it. Whereas if you're using something like a speedball pen, if you flex it, if you push down harder, it will actually create a line that's wider. But then I also remember when I was first learning inking, there was a lot of pushback from even older people in the industry about using speedball pens. Even using speedball pens was seen as being a cheat because they had learned by using brushes. The nice thing about using brushes is it's incredibly easy to vary your line width. The downside is they're incredibly difficult to use. They're very, very, very difficult to master. Speedball pens are much easier. So with the rise of technical pens and things like micron pens, there's a certain style of inking that began to develop that would seem very, well, technical, actually, going with that style of pen that was losing a certain amount of character, but it could be replaced with a different type. You would just go for density of detail instead of the individual line width. And now today, people will concentrate more on using things like pit pens. I don't have anything against them. In fact, I will be using some later in this illustration. And I showed a few of mine in the opening section of this video, but I tend to leave them for very specific things. Now, you'll see two things about me doing this background. While there are areas that are straight lines, you notice I'm never using a ruler. This is due to the style that I'm going for. There are certain types of science fiction illustrations where everything is supposed to be super clean and all the lines will end up being perfect. And actually that works super well using technical pens. It's for that kind of illustration. Every straight line will be perfectly straight. The curves will be completely consistent. This is much grittier cyberpunk kind of a setting, and with a few minor exceptions for some pieces, generally I'm not working with any rulers, any guides like that at all. And things that a lot of other people would use a technical pen for, I'm instead using a speedball pen for, to be able to create that extra grittiness, that extra line weight, varying line weight. And once in a while, grabbing a brush like I am right here, just to fill in these larger areas. Now, this could be done with the speedball pen. I have multiple nibs, some of which are much, much wider. Frankly, it works much faster. to be able to fill in these spots with a pen, with a brush. Here's an old school comic book inking thing. It was not uncommon for a lot of inkers in comics, when they had large sections that need to be filled in with black, they would actually be outlined with either a brush or a speedball pen, and then they would put a small cross or a small plus sign to indicate that this area needs to be filled in with black. And so either they or an assistant would go in later and start basically, if anybody ever talks about spotting blacks, that's kind of where that comes from, or that's one of the ways that people would do that. You just outline the areas that you wanted these massive amounts of black in, put in a cross, put in a little plus sign, and then quickly fill those in later. I'm not doing that here because I want even the areas that are completely black. They're not completely black, for the most part. A lot of them I did fill in a lot of detail with the speedball pen, but then I'm also still doing a lot of work with the pen, with the brush on top of that, to create a little bit. Those flat black areas are not completely flat black. There's always going to be something in them that's reflecting light from different directions. So that way there's just a touch more depth added in, a touch more texture, just a little bit more kinetic energy to the background. I kind of want the sense that everything is moving, even when it's not, in the same way that rust itself is an organic. It feels like it's an organic process. It's the destruction of metal. It's very slow moving, but it is moving. And if you see rust, it gives it an organic feel. This is kind of like that. So even though everything in these backgrounds is fixed, they're all metals and plastics and such. There's so much tight detail everywhere that it gives the sense of motion even where nothing is moving. There's this constant energy. And now I'm going in periodically to just deepen a few of the shadows. But, and I'm also adding in a slightly darker line, a slightly thicker line around that statue. That's another thing I'm going to be talking about on the main figure too, where this is another method for separating planes. Earlier I was talking about the various planes in an illustration, and you don't really want things falling into them. You don't want the ground to look like it's disappearing into the sky necessarily. If you want that, that's fine, but you don't want that to be happening if that's not your intent. So what you end up doing is separating those planes. And previously I was talking about color saturation and color temperature as ways to separate those planes. But another way is also line weight. Adding a thicker line around certain objects pulls them forward, separates them from the background. Now, I'll actually be using two methods like that on the main character herself later on once I've gotten into a bit more work with her. But right now I want to talk about how... So I'm still drawing the deep background, but now it's through these sections of glass, these glass panels. For the most part, the glass panels have the same amount of detail. The background you see through the glass panels is the same amount of detail that you see above it, where there is no intervening surface. But there will be a few things that will make it separate a little bit more. One of them is where that background intersects with a hard object, such as the physical railing, the line art from the background touches that railing. But now you can see here where the line art goes up to the top of the glass and doesn't intersect with another metal object or something. There's actually a slight gap. So I'm leaving a thin amount of white between the line art in the deep background and the edge of the glass, just to imply the reflection and the refraction of light within that glass, creating kind of a thin white or a thin lighter area on the edges of it. It'll become more obvious as more and more detail gets put into these backgrounds, but yeah, that tends to be something I'll do for car windshields, for windows, glasses. If a character is wearing glasses, I won't tend to draw the line art behind the glass going right to the edge of that glass. There'll always be a little bit of a gap, especially if the glass is curved. In fact, the more the glass is curved, the more of that white space you want to leave to indicate the refraction of light and the reflection of light. So, but yeah, still putting in the same amount of tight detail, the same amount of texture in the deep background behind this glass that I had in all the other areas. There are a few places here that I left a little bit open, and those will end up being filled in with the brush. But still, for the most part, where I'm going for deep shadows, a lot of that is still done with the pen instead of a brush, at least initially. And then once I've determined, no, those need to go even deeper, then I'll grab the brush and start filling that in a bit more. While I can go in with white ink later on, if I realize something went a bit too dark, I'd much rather build things up in layers. I'd rather add these layers of darkness, and then if I realize there's not enough darkness, just add that in more with more additional black ink, rather than realize, oh, that whole area should have been white. Now I'll just drop white on top of it. There's room for both, but I know which one I tend to prefer working with. So the bulk of the very, very, very far background, the interior of this atrium space, is now completed, and I'm getting into working on the statue. So I had mentioned I don't like I mentioned I prefer working from the upper left-hand corner of an illustration to the bottom right, so that way I'm not dragging any ink. I won't accidentally smudge any with my hand. There had been a period of time, probably a few hours, between finishing all the deep background and getting into working on this next layer, to make sure that all the background was dry. And frankly, to make sure to give my hand a rest. I've had issues with arthritis over the years, so it's very important to make sure that you take breaks from drawing periodically. Technically, I have reshapen the fingers on my right hand because of drawing for so many decades. But I'm trying to minimize that these days. So making sure to take longer breaks, working on a section. When I get to a certain point, just stop, take a break, watch a movie or something. So yeah, now I'm working on the statuary. The inking method I'm using here is very similar to that deep background, but I want to give it the impression of a different texture. The background is mostly metal. It's metallic objects all over the place, a lot of plastics and other synthetic substances all over the place. It's like you would see in any abandoned mall, really. It's supposed to look very gritty and very rugged. This statue, however, I'm going with a very rough stone texture. So there'll be a lot of areas that are really wide open to give it that feel of stone instead of metal. Although there are actually large sections of black, that'll be different to help define the light source. You can see that below the arms, on the underside of each of the arms, I've actually left that open as fairly white. That's because that's going to be something I'm going to go back in with a brush to put in some heavier blacks. They won't fill in completely from the top to the bottom in those white areas, because I also want to leave in the implication that there's light coming from below. but there certainly will be some strong blacks done in such a way to help separate it from the deep background. But certain areas will go completely black. The areas under these bird masks, these giant beaks, are completely in shadow. That will really help define the light coming from above the statue, creating these massive black areas. But right now, I'm concentrating on these figures. This particular type of statue, it has 3 faces. So forward, to the left, and then to the right. We only really see the forward and facing to our left, the statue's right. The third one would be presumably on the other side of the face that we can't see, on the other side of the head. But dealing mostly with light coming from above, there'd be that's certainly not the only light source affecting it. That's why we actually have light coming from the side. You can see there are white areas on the sides that I'll be leaving open. There's light sources coming from all over the place. But the primary ones that are affecting it are these huge overhead clusters of lights. But I still have some secondary and tertiary lights in the environment to make sure that the statue doesn't completely disappear into the background. So there will be basically a white rim light all the way around the statue, in much the same way that there'd be a similar one on the main figure, but the main figure will have an additional way to separate her from all the various layers behind her. But yeah, right now I'm concentrating on building up where those large sections of black, the large sections of shadow will end up being on the statue, while still keeping this, it's not quite pointillism style inking, but it's very similar. Like, I'm not drawing a whole lot of long lines anywhere within the body of the statue. It's all very short lines. You can see I'm almost like tapping on the paper when I'm laying down these lines. Just working with that stone texture a bit more. But yeah, and I want to make that consistent all the way through. I want to make sure that I'm doing it the same way on every part of the statue. The only part that I wouldn't be doing that on would be where it goes completely to black, when there would be any sort of super large areas that are completely in shadow. The complete shadows, the large amounts of huge shadow, that's much more of a film noir thing. Now, there is a lot of crossover between cyberpunk imagery and film noir. But we're doing, but there's enough distinction that I want to make sure that I don't have too much in the way of deep blacks all the way through this. In fact, where I have the deepest blacks will actually be on the main figure, on the figure of the guitarist, as another way to separate her from the background. So there's multiple things going on in this illustration to separate the various planes from each other. But then ultimately, remembering that the focus of this illustration is the main character. Now, in coloring comics, in inking, in doing any sort of composition related to illustrations in general, but comic book work in particular, I know there is a tendency to deal with the foreground imagery first at every stage. And I've talked about how I don't do that. I do that when I do my initial composition. But once I'm like you've been seeing here doing the inking, and I'll be doing the same thing when I get to the coloring, I work the opposite direction. I work in the negative space first. I work from backwards to back to front. When I first started working in comic book coloring back in '97, working at Digital Chameleon, I was taught to paint, to do all the coloring on the main characters first, leave all the backgrounds to last, because we're very deadline oriented, and you wanted to make sure if you're really concentrating on work, you're doing that when you're fresh, and you want that to be done on the most important elements in any illustration, which tend to be the main characters. The backgrounds are where you could not necessarily cheat, but if the deadlines were approaching and they had to be finished quickly, that portion, it would be better. If you had to rush anywhere, that'd be the portion that you would rush. I always found for myself, I much preferred working from the back to the front, because that tended to give me more forward momentum. I'm always having something to look forward to. I'll start with the most boring parts, get those out of the way. And then I can really concentrate on the parts I want to work on the primary portions, the main characters. And I ended up discovering that first off, that did work faster for me. But secondly, I just really loved creating the environments that the characters were inhabiting. And by the time I got to working on the main character, after I'd done all the work on the background, there were decisions I had made in the background that changed what I ended up wanting to do on the main characters. So, for instance, working on an illustration of a robot, I may have gone into it with the idea that if I look at one of my very simple red-blue illustrations, if I started with the main character when approaching the coloring and determined the red light is coming from the upper left, and the blue light is coming from the lower right. And that's how I painted the character. I go to the background, and I still play with those basic ideas. I try to separate it. I might actually reverse those colors to make sure the character pops. But I'll still be dealing with all of that. However, because I like to work from the back to the front, I'll start with the environment and figure out, well, where is this blue light coming from? Like, I can actually paint in the light source itself. And once I've done all that, I figure out where the light sources are, and have them interacting with the background, and then I start painting the main character, I realize that red light coming from the upper left-hand side is bouncing off of another object in that background. So say the character is standing beside a car, and I've already painted the background. I've painted the car, but I wanted to make sure that the car was consistently part of that same environment. So I had the red light from the upper left-hand side going down on it. Look, I realized that red light would then be bouncing back onto the lower, if it came from the upper left, that light would be bouncing onto the lower right portion of the character as well. So even though there's this main blue light in the lower right-hand corner of the illustration being cast onto the main character, that car is reflecting some red light into the middle of that same spot. So I would add a little highlight of red in the middle of all this blue. And the character comes so much more to life when I do that. Because now the character is inhabiting their environment. They are reflecting the environment that I've created. And everything just feels more alive. So that's pretty much how I've always been doing this. That's how I've been doing this for decades anyway. And it does tend to work for me. Now, I will point out there is something I've done in this illustration that I realize it wasn't necessarily a mistake. It's just something I know I wanted to go back and work on a bit more. Under the arm of the character, of the statue, I've made the blacks very, very deep, very wide. It's working, but when I get to work on the main character, I'll realize that those large sections of black will be too similar to some of the large sections of black on the main character. So I realized at this point that, okay, now I can go back and add a little bit of white into some of those deep shadows, just to make it pop a bit more, just to separate the main character from that statue. But for the most part, The major the major lighting decisions have been made on that statue. All the heavy shadows are below because it's indicating the light is coming from above. But I do want to play a little bit more with some of the secondary light. And you can see, like, there is on the left-hand side of the arm of that statue. So the arm, let's see. Let's look at the arm furthest to the left on this illustration. There's a large section of white on the upper side of it, but there's also some white on the lower part, indicating that there's light coming from below and to the left, not just above and to the right. A certain amount, not nearly as large an area, but that is telling us that, yeah, there's more light in the environment than just the great big, spotlights at the top of the structure. But I'm going to come back to that and add a little bit more white into all of that. So now I'm starting to play with the inking on that statue through the sections, through these panels of glass. And again, just like I did with the deep background, this for the most part is being inked the same way as all the other portions of her, or of the statue, but where the inking gets close to the edge of the glass, I'm leaving a white line. And it's actually not like the inking itself, actually. It's kind of varied. It's not perfectly straight. It indicates there are imperfections in the glass. The glass is probably slightly wavy. Might not be exactly the same thickness all the way through. Frankly, other lights in the area could be causing the light to refract differently, or at least appear to. There's a lot of different reasons as to why it would be that wavy. But yeah, now we're dealing with the heaviest sections of black on the statue's leg. It's the furthest away from the major light sources above. So this is where some of the deepest blacks will end up being. And now that I put in those large black areas with the brush, I'm working on a bit of the stone texture with the speedball pen, just to give it a bit more depth, a bit more texture, a bit more physicality. Now, when I was talking about how the lighting on in the background can end up changing decisions I make on working on the lighting on the main characters, that's mostly due to the proximity of the main character to that deep background. In this case, however, the main character is really far forward from all the major background elements. The only thing that she's close to is the railing that she's leaning on. Everything else is 100, 200, 300 feet away. So any sort of lighting reflection from that, from the statue or anything else back there, really doesn't affect her a whole heck of a lot. In which case, the very fact that I'm going to be making sure the lighting on her is very different than the lighting in the background also tells part of the story. It by itself, it will add depth. It will show that she is physically further forward in space. And that's reinforced by the fact that the lighting affecting everything behind her is not affecting her. She has different light sources on her. So it all depends on what it is you're working on. But these are things I will think about all the way through the composition. Even when I'm doing my initial, even coming up with the original idea, I'll start at that point thinking about where my light sources are and why they're there. What kind of lights are these? Is it sunlight coming through a broken ceiling? Are these huge spotlights in a partially dilapidated atrium / megaplex? Is this lights coming off of a visor of a robot in front of the character, just off panel that we can't see? Anything like that. Those I'll just start thinking about various story elements Even when I'm doing something simple, this is a relatively simple piece. It's a relatively simple pinup of a character. I still want to imply story. I still want to imply that there's something going on beyond just there's a character standing there holding a guitar. There is a character standing there holding a guitar, but she's leaning against a railing in this atrium. There is this giant statue behind her. What does all of this mean? Like, the guitar itself, it isn't just a guitar. It has a particular style, like a very new wave style from the 80s. Her particular outfit is a combination of 50s rock and roll and some, a touch of new wave. There's actually nothing aggressively cyberpunk about this image, but the overall feel is still will have that cyberpunk feel. Like, she's not a cyborg, but and as you can see here, now that I'm getting into working with the pit pens, now these are a type of essentially they're markers, but most of them have a little bit more flexibility in the tip than the technical pens I was talking about earlier. Technical pens are incredibly precise. They again, if you want to make a line on a technical pen wider, you have to draw basically another line right beside the first one that's touching it, so it's actually physically wider. With most of these pit pens, however, the tip, if you push down a little bit harder, will create a wider line. And some of them are full-on brush pens, or they're very easy to vary the line width on. But I wanted to have one. I want to be using ones with a little bit more precision and a little bit easier to use when I'm working on these tight details on the face of the character, when I'm working on her outfit. Excuse me. I don't want it to be quite as random as on the elements in the background. So doing using the speedball pen all the way through for the background, varying between that and brushes worked just fine. Because, again, I'm going for that cyberpunk feel. Even though it's a high-tech mechanical setting, very few straight edges. It all feels like it's sort of bodged together. It could be falling apart. Yet nothing is super clean. There shouldn't really be a whole ton of straight edges. If you take it to its the full cyberpunk feel, the only straight edges you find are in the super expensive, high-end corporate areas. Anything where regular people are living in don't really have that feel. And that's very easy to get. It's very easy to capture that sensation using the speedball pens, using a brush. If I was using a crow quill pen is very similar to those speedball pens I'm using. The basically you just you use them with a small bottle of black ink or whatever color ink, and you dip the pen into it. But crow quill pens can be tricky to use. I do have a few. I am not always the best with using those, so I find for when I want to do tighter detail, I'll vary it. There actually are some illustrations I've done where I used a speedball pen all the way through. If I wanted the character to look a little bit rougher, that's a good way to do that. If I'm not worrying about the lines being super, super thin, using a speedball pen all the way through helps with that. But with her, I wanted there to be a blend. The leather jacket in particular, it'll still be glossy. It won't be completely matte. It won't be completely worn out. So those sorts of elements, no, it's a little bit nicer to create that sensation using these pit pens. There will be points that I'll end up filling in large areas of black with a brush, or with a speedball pen. But yeah, for the most part, this whole section is now being done with the pit pens, and you can see how much cleaner the line art already looks. This is another way where I am separating the character from the background, separating her from the environment that she's living in. she's clearly part of it. She seems appropriate for this place. She doesn't look like she doesn't belong here, but it's still obvious that she's moved forward further in space. She's not as tall as the statue behind her. You need to worry about things like that if you have what looks like two characters standing side by side, but the intent is that one of them is standing 3 feet away from the viewer, and the other one is a giant statue that's 300 feet away from the viewer. Well, you don't want them to look like they're standing side by side. You want to use a lot of different techniques in order to be able to separate those two elements in space. So here, I'm using cleaner lines. There won't be as much texture on her, whether it's on the skin or on the outfit or on the guitar. In fact, this guitar is a fairly clean design. I'm going with either it's all made of almost a chromed out metal or a super reflective plastic. There's some combination of both, I guess. When I get to working on the amplifier, there will be elements of that will end up being a lot grungier looking and will look a little bit closer to what the background is. But even with that, that'll still just be in sections. It won't be universally all the way through it. It'll still be very easy to show it being separated from the rest of the environment. Now, these are all techniques that I'm using to make sure these various layers, these various levels, are separated from each other in the ink illustration itself. Because I'm doing a digital coloring pass on this later, however, there are additional steps. There are additional tricks I'll be able to use to separate them even further in space, giving it even more of a Blade Runner, a full-on Ridley Scott feel in parts of it. But I don't want to just leave it to be that. I don't want to have to rely on just using Photoshop to solve any problems that are created in the line art. I don't want Photoshop to be a solution. I just want it to be something to enhance something I've already put in there. So it's important for me that the line art works, that this needs to be a standalone ink image. It's going into a book. It's going into there'll be I'll be showing the portfolio book that this goes into. All the ink pieces in that portfolio book have to be standalone ink illustrations. They have to look complete the way they are. But then I'll be doing a color version as well. And so I want to make sure that the ink version makes it very clear she is standing in front of a railing several hundred feet away from a giant statue, which itself is in this mammoth environment. And just making sure that the more I do that in the earlier steps, the more real the whole image feels. And I don't mean real from a hyper-realistic art style kind of way. I don't need this to look like a photograph. This is not going to be a photograph. This is still a stylized comic book style image. But I want to feel like she is part of a real world. Like this is a space. The space she's inhabiting does have stories. It does have stories and characters that a viewer will care about or want to care about. A lot of what I end up doing comes down to story. Like I said earlier, even if it's just a pinup, I still want to feel like there's something there. It isn't just, it isn't some woman posing with a guitar. This is the lead guitarist of a band. She uses that guitar. And I'm not showing her in the band. I'm not showing her playing, but I want it to be clear that no, this is a thing that actually happens. There is a story here. She might be prepping for a gig. She might be just done with a gig. Probably not. She'd probably look a lot more worn out. Might be waiting for somebody to buy this guitar. Who knows? But I want the viewer. I don't want to answer questions like that. I don't want to tell the viewer exactly what's going on. But I want the viewer to think that there is something going on. and the viewer can then make those decisions themselves. So, still dealing with these very clean lines, a little bit of extra hatching here and there, but for the most part, these pants, they're not full on leather, but they're still a very clean style. Again, separating it from the rougher elements in the background, carrying it all the way through. So similar to the leather jacket she's wearing, but not quite the same texture. It won't be quite, and I know when I get to the coloring stage of this, it won't be quite as reflective. But it'll still have huge sections, a lot more contrast. Let's say that. Both the pants and the jacket have a lot more contrast than her shirt does. The same as with the skin tone. In general, when I'm doing skin tones, I don't put in a whole lot of detail. I much prefer to leave as much of that open as I can while still indicating the light sources. If there's anything that I will change my technique on based on the fact that I'm going to be, whether or not I'm doing any coloring in Photoshop afterwards, it'll end up being on skin tones. There will be some, once in a while, I'll leave the skin completely open with no detail drawn within the figure itself, so that all of that sort of work can be done in Photoshop. But even with that, I will vary the line width on the exterior lines. And what does that mean? The line of a figure that's away from a light source will be thicker than the side of the body that is closer to a light source. So, for instance, if you drew a balloon with a great big light very close to it on the right-hand side, you would want the curved line on the left-hand side, the side away from that light on that balloon, to be thicker than the line on the right-hand side. Even if you drew no detail within the body of the balloon itself, just the fact that you varied that line width on the outside line gives the viewer an indication of where that light source is, the kind of environment it's living in. So you can see I was just adding in a whole lot more large black areas onto the guitar there. And I've left these large areas of white on the pants. Those will be filled in later as large flat black areas with a brush. I did not put in the little X's or little crosses or whatnot, but I know that they will be done that way because I'm going to be the one doing them. Notice, however, on the neck of the guitar, where the strings would be, I have not drawn any strings. That was a deliberate choice. I will be doing a white ink pass over this later for adding in certain highlights and such. At that point, I'm actually going to draw in a few white strings to... Now, from this distance, you really wouldn't, depending on what color the neck is, you really wouldn't see a ton of detail. I will be adding a little bit more black ink to indicate those strings a little bit later, but for the most part, you really wouldn't see a ton of that. But I will be touching it up with some white ink later on. Now, I am putting in some inking detail on the figure, on the skin, because that does work here. I don't want it to be completely wide open and just colored in Photoshop, but it won't have necessarily as much detail or as much contrast as the jacket or the pants, certainly than as any of the other elements in this illustration. But again, I want this illustration to be able to stand alone as an ink piece, but then with enough white space left in there that I have something to color when I'm working with Photoshop. So it's a bit of a blend, dealing with a few different things here. And just inking the abdomen at the moment. Don't want to do a ton of detail here because it's not raised too far. I had much more detail on the neck and under the jawline. I tend to put in a fairly heavy shadow underneath the jawline on characters to really make the head separate well from the neck, from the rest of the body. Ultimately, the most important thing on a character are the eyes, then the face itself, then the overall head, and then outward from there. So much in the same way that I drew the background first, I'm working from the least expressive to the most expressive on the figure as well. So I did background to foreground on the character. I did open by starting to detail eyes and such, but when I'm doing all the detail work, I did everything around the face, but then I'll end up doing the face last, except for the large areas that I'll just be filling in with black. But right now, dealing with the side lighting, again, showing, now we're getting really into showing that the main light source is coming from the left-hand side of the frame. And now working on, this is an interesting part. Okay. Well, hopefully you think it's interesting. This amp has a screen on it where the speakers are held. Now, for the most part, when you see an amp like this in the real world, you will see the screen, and that's pretty much all you see. Once in a while, though, especially when they're older ones, and it's getting beat up a whole lot, and it starts getting very thin, you will see the shape of the speakers underneath that mesh, and that is something I'm going to be dealing with here. So the primary inking, the primary black inking, is pretty much all done. Once these elements on the amplifier are completed, then it'll be a lot of filling in the black areas. As I said, I'm putting in a lot of detail on that screen and then tweaking it, adding in some additional shading so you can see the shape of the actual speaker or speakers inside that amplifier. But I believe that takes care of the bulk of the detailed inking. Now we're getting into just filling in the large black areas with another brush. I'll usually alternate between two different brushes, cleaning them off periodically in that cup sitting there. Unlike what I'm planning on doing with the statue, where I need to add a little bit more light underneath it, these sections of black will be pretty much left completely flat black after I've put in after I've done the brush work here. That's another good way actually to separate those planes that I was talking about earlier. So I'll have larger areas of flat black on the foreground, the large areas of flat black in the middle layer, the one with the statue, will end up being broken up a bit more with white ink to separate that a little bit more. And then in the deep background, there's almost none. It's almost completely just almost a, the eye will think of it as being almost a gray in the deep background. And that's actually another way for separating layers with regard to inking. I talked earlier about using color theory to help separate layers, but there's also one approach in inking that works really well, where if you're looking at an illustration that has 3 layers, and the vast majority of them will end up having either 2 or 3 layers, if you think of one of them as being the black layer, one of them being the gray layer, and one of them being the white layer, what does that mean? If there's a lot of tight detail over a large area, your eye will actually kind of see that as being gray. All those small lines or all that detail with a little bit of white interspersed will actually kind of merge together, and your eye will think of it as being gray. If the illustration is primarily black, say a character being cast in deep shadow, then that would be your black layer, or the black plane. Or if an area is just completely filled with white, you want that to be basically filled with light. That would be the light area, and that's one method for separating planes, for separating layers when just doing black and white illustration. Think of the work of Jim Steranko. Was really good. He's very, very good for doing work like that, especially his more film noirish kind of compositions, where the deep background would be primarily black. The middle ground with the character would be more of a gray, and in the foreground he would have a lit up object that would just jump off the page. That's something that he's focusing, that the main character is looking at or focusing on. And that would be mostly in white. That would be an excellent way to separate those three layers. It isn't so much about not wanting the viewer to be confused. Sometimes that's actually a valid technique in art. That's part of what you're trying to do. But if really what you're trying to do is make clear storytelling, you want to do as much as you can to aid the viewer into be able to figure out where everything is situated in space, what the relationship is between the various objects. So again, in this case, the guitarist, the guitar, the amplifier, and even that railing, all fairly forward in the frame, very close to the viewer. The statue several hundred feet behind, and then the atrium several hundred feet behind that. Now, primary black inking has been completed. I'm now switching over to the Dr. P.H. Martin's white ink to do some additional effects. Now, I had mentioned there was an additional way I was separating the main character from the background and from all the other elements in the story, or in this image. In addition to putting a thicker black line around here, I'm now adding an additional white line that physically separates the ink in her illustration from everything else behind her. This isn't always appropriate. Sometimes you want characters coming out of the shadow, in which case you would not put a white line separating them from that particular shadow. But in this instance, especially given the distance between her and everything behind her, adding an additional white light or little white line completely surrounding, acting as an additional border around the character, serves really well just to further differentiate that character from everything else, further separating her. She's part of the background, but I don't want her to look like it's just an abstract pattern. I want to give her a bit more of a three-dimensional feel. And again, that's this sense of realism in that she's inhabiting a real space that's further forward in space from everything behind her. Again, we're not talking about hyper-realism. I'm not going for any sort of photorealism or anything like that. It's still fairly stylized, still fairly comic book stylized. This is just helping with creating that sense of space. Now, if you look at my prior work, I spent a lot of years just concentrating mostly on digital art, a lot of digital painting, digital illustrations. I've even done a series of digital inking illustrations. The last few years, I've been going back more and more to having one of the steps in a fully colored piece being drawing either in pencil or in pencil and then ink on paper, putting a physical media portion back into the illustration. This is really just being done because that's what I prefer. It's going back to more of my comic book roots, the fact that so much of my storytelling comes from comic book style storytelling and compositions and such. And I really like that feel. And I'm finding out the last few years I've been really enjoying getting back into working with inking and frankly working with speedball pens in particular, both with black ink and with white ink. Now you can see here that I'm actually using the white ink to highlight the speaker inside that speaker cabinet, inside that amplifier. Oh, and here's where I'm talking a bit about adding a bit more light from underneath into the statue. So rather than creating any sort of large sections of white light, I'm just putting in more of these white dots or streaks so that any light that's being cast from below up onto the statue, it's interacting with the same texture as every other portion of the statue. It's just reinforcing the notion that this is stone, not necessarily a very polished stone either. And of course, adding the signature. That was the last step for doing the inking portion. This actually goes into one of my inking portfolio books. You can see another image there, playing with two characters from the book that this setting for this piece comes from. So now there's one step I'm not showing because it's a little mundane, but it's the one where I scan the image so that I can then paint it in Photoshop. I'll talk about that in a second, but right now I'm just setting up the page in Photoshop. So I had scanned it at 1200 DPI, so 1200 dots per inch. This is being done full size at 11 inches by 17 inches. But once I've scanned that and I get that super clean scan, when I go to start painting it, I'll actually drop the resolution down to 600. Now, what does that mean? You don't want to drop it below 300. 300 DPI is basically the minimum for print. So that whatever you're printing at that physical size, whether it's comic book size, whether it's 8.5 by 11, if it's 300 DPI, then it will print clear. It'll look quite nice. But if you want to blow it up from that size, 300 DPI doesn't give you a lot of room. You'll end up getting a lot of artifacting. It'll start looking fuzzy. Whereas when I do the original scan at 1200 and then take it down to 600, I still have a lot of wiggle room. And remember, I'm painting this, even though I'm using a lot of comic book techniques, I'm not painting it at comic book size. I'm painting this at 11 by 17. If I was to take this down to a printer, I could have it printed at 11 by 17, 600 DPI. It would look incredibly crisp. But it also means that I could make a much larger poster from this and have a lot of leeway with regard to how clean it all looks and how it doesn't really start getting blurry or anything. So I much prefer having that sort of freedom. Now, here, I'm laying down a bunch of flat colors that'll separate the various elements in this illustration. The final coloring of the piece, and you'll probably have seen what the final piece looks like in the intro to this video, doesn't necessarily have any bearing on what these colors are right now that I've been using. They're basically just to create these flat colors that I can choose later. I actually created a flats channel. I've been, as I've mentioned, I've been using Photoshop since 1997, and I was using it on machines that were a lot slower and a lot less powerful than the one I'm using right now. We had to be very conscious in that studio at Digital Chameleon about how much memory was being used at any given time on any particular image. So the fewer number of layers you could have on a page, the better. And I still tend to paint that way. Now, we would never have painted at 600 DPI. We never would have done any comic book work at that resolution because that was far too big. That would slow down the machines far, far too much. The rig I'm using right now has no problems with this. So much so that I've encountered the reason I don't paint this at 1200 DPI, at the actual size that I scan the inks, is very quickly I hit the upper limit for a regular Photoshop file. I only discovered this recently, that regular Photoshop files have a maximum size of 2 gigabytes. You can save a Photoshop working file larger than that, but it saves it into a different type of Photoshop file. So I decided, no, I'll just go ahead and just use the 2 gig limit, and work from there. But it does mean that I tend to try to work a bit more efficiently. I do things more in channels than in layers because they're a lot more memory efficient, a lot easier to use, a lot easier for the computer to deal with. Now already here I am working on the deep background and in the actual painting, and you can already see how much I've been changing the color over what the original flat colors were. When I lay down those flat colors, I then create a flat, what's called a flats channel, that if I need to, if I painted all this and I've collapsed all the layers, and I realized there was something in the background I wanted to tweak, whether the entire background at once or just one piece of it, I'll actually go into that flats channel, use the magic wand tool to select that area, and then go back into the painting, and it'll have isolated it from everything else. So I won't accidentally be painting over any other elements in the illustration. But yeah, you could pretty much use, with the technique that I do, you can use pretty much any color you want for the flat colors. It doesn't make any difference. I am not going to be using those. Now, usually if I'm dealing with backgrounds, all the colors will be cool colors, and I'm dealing with foregrounds, all the colors will be warm. But you know, that's just a rough guide. It really doesn't mean anything with regard to the final painting. Using a lot of the brush tool here, but I was also using a lot of the gradient tool to create some color pattern in the deep background. Now I'm adding in some of those panels in the background, where later on in other illustrations I'll be adding in actual advertisements and such. But for this one, I just wanted to keep it as a simpler pattern. Clearly there was something going on in those panels. All right, now we're getting into the statue. Another technique I use is when I'm painting, when I first select the area, put it onto a separate layer, and then lock that layer so that I can paint over the whole thing, and it won't paint anything around it. It won't, as you notice, I'm using the gradient tool. That gradient color is not affecting the background. It's not affecting the foreground. It's only working on the area I selected. I go with the darkest color possible. The first color I put in will be the heaviest shadow, and then I start painting with light. So in this instance, I went with basically almost a complete black, and then started experimenting with different values of blue to grad into that, to use the gradient tool into that. And once I came up with basically midtones that I was happy with, now with the brush tool, I'm going in and painting some of the side lights, some of the top light, so that I can vary the color that I've used. I'm also, the color, the light from above is a very cool color. It's mostly a lot of blues, but from below, it's a little bit warmer. There's a lot more magenta in that. So it's going to be a little bit more of a purple effect coming from below. This adds shape and mass to the figure. So the color of the light itself is not the same in all directions. It implies that this thing I'm painting, this giant statue, is actually a three-dimensional object. You can have it be all the same color values, the same tones and such, from each direction. But if you vary that a bit, it'll end up adding a little bit more light and a little bit more life, a little bit more reality to the image. And you see this in films all the time, where the most obvious example would be in Michael Bay films, where one side of the figure is lit in orange and the other side is lit in blue. just a good way to add a three-dimensional feel and a sense of reality to the scene. So after working on that, so I've done the deep background, and I've done most of the painting on the statue. As I said before, when I'm inking, I ink from back to front. When I'm painting, I paint from back to front. So I've done my deep background. I've done my middle background. Now I'm working on the railing behind the main character. So now we're basically into the foreground and twisting the actual canvas to make it a bit easier to paint from the side. We could not, going back to the digital chameleon days, the horsepower that the computers we were using back then, they could not do this. It was technically possible to rotate the canvas. You could not do it this easily. I'm thinking there's actually a computer under my desk right now. It's one that my wife had purchased when the studio Digital Chameleon closed back in 2003. It was the computer that she used on her desk. It's a G3 Mac with a total of 4 gigs, I believe, of memory, not RAM. 4 gigs of hard drive space. I don't even remember what the RAM would be on this. I was using a G5, I think, at the end. So I think I had 10 gigs. But yeah, those things did not have anywhere near the power of the PC I'm currently painting this on. As an aside, just the hard drive space between the SSDs and the NVMe drives. I have 7 terabytes of space on this computer, never mind all the archive drives I have kicking around. I believe, actually, to go into that a bit further, the system I'm using this with, it's a PC, i7 9700 CPU, 3090 Ti GPU, and a total of 7 terabytes of space, which is split up over, let's see, 5 different drives. I have 5. Those are for very specific purposes. There's like a 2 terabyte drive that's just for games. There's a 1 terabyte drive that is just for painting. There's another terabyte drive that is just for video editing. I like keeping things separate. Plus, I'm also used to having to deal with scratch disk space. Basically, one way to look at scratch disk space in Photoshop is it's almost pretend RAM. Where Photoshop would use part of unused space on a hard drive as basically temporary RAM. And we used to run into scratch disk full errors all the time back in Digital Chameleon. I don't run into that anymore because I'm using 32 gigs of RAM, but I still have it set that there's pretty much just a dedicated 1 terabyte SSD just for Photoshop, just for illustration work, just in case. Old habits die hard. All right, now we're into the deep foreground, working on much warmer tones, painting this amplifier. And you can see all the way through this, my pattern has been, when I select an area, I will put in the darkest color possible for that particular item, and then start painting lighter colors on top of it. The downside to doing that, and this is something that we would frequently run into back at Digital, and you have to be very careful about how you do it, is when you then go to print something, you find it's printing way, way darker than you think it will. Because you just didn't add enough light. So I'm always aware of that. The way you get around that is learning what the color values mean in print. You're kind of painting with math. You'll notice there's a section of 4 sliders open more or less in the middle of the screen, my CMYK sliders. That math is showing me, it's not just showing me what that color looks like on screen, but it's also showing me the value of the individual color channels, the cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And it's up to me to remember what those numbers mean with regard to what it would look like in print. Everything I paint is done with the intent of it being printed. So I have to always keep an eye on those color values to make sure that I know what it's roughly going to look like in print, so that it won't be too dark, that it'll be the correct shades. There's always going to be a certain amount of variance. There's variation in printing in each printer that you ever put something on. Every screen you ever look at will have a slight color variance from the screen right beside it, no matter how well calibrated it is. Plus, monitors fall out of calibration. Monitors will change their color periodically. So will printers. So the more you can do to basically error-proof your artwork, the better that you know what it's supposed to look like by looking at the math, the better chance you'll have of the final result looking like what you're wanting it to look like. I don't know how much people really deal with this anymore, because I know color calibration is a big deal for monitors, and it's certainly much better than it was when I first got into doing this back in the 90s. I will still only trust it just so far. So now into painting the body of the guitar. And again, very clean. The artwork on it is fairly clean compared to a lot of other things. It gives me a lot of things in the illustration, so it gives me plenty of room to play with color. So I want to work with big, bold sections of color, primarily dealing with the warm red tones coming from the left of frame, and then these cooler blue tones coming from the right. Here I'm painting back some darker blue into the centerpiece to show how it's actually aimed a little bit more towards the right. Not as much as, say, the side of the guitar, where it actually goes to black, but it's aimed just enough that it's picking up a little bit of the bluer light coming from the side. So that's one of the ways you can help define the shape, the three-dimensional shape of an object, is just how it's picking up the light in the environment. And that helps, going back to the idea of using different color of light in different directions. That those color values will end up helping you define if there's blue light here, and I've established that the blue light is coming from the right-hand side of the frame, it must be reflecting something from that side, or it's reflecting light that's bouncing around in the environment. Is there something else just off panel or behind the viewer that's reflecting this back onto the object? Now here I'm keeping the color and lighting pattern fairly simple. We're not getting into any really crazy reflection patterns, which I do sometimes. I love painting a lot of robots, and specifically to be able to paint a lot of chrome. My favorite character in comics to paint has always been Iron Man, because of getting to paint all those reflections. But here I'm not going to deal with a whole lot with reflections. It's going to be as shiny as the surface of this guitar body is. It's really just going to be dealing with the larger color and light patterns in the environment without dealing with a whole lot of reflections of the environment. But yeah, this is, if we get back to, let's see, I don't necessarily need to be able to figure out what the color looks like by looking at, okay. So getting back to talking about color calibrations in monitors, all monitors, even today, lie. I'm sure the best tuned monitor will show you how it's going to print briefly. As soon as that monitor is on for any length of time, it'll start falling out of calibration. Might not fall out by very much anymore. It was probably a bigger deal in the days of CRTs. But one trick that we did back at Digital, just to remind everybody about how you can't trust monitors, is that on everybody's desk, there were two monitors. The large, relatively large, I believe they were 21-inch monitors on the left-hand side of the desk. That's where you did the primary painting. But then it'd be a smaller monitor on the right-hand side of the desk. Photoshop was being displayed in both the monitors, but you tended to put all of your tools, all of your palettes, and by palette, I mean, actually, it's on the screen right now in the dead center of the image. There's just a bunch of color swatches. I'm using those as samples to help me figure out the colors that I'm using to make them consistent. But all your color palettes, especially if you're working on characters like Superman, which we did a lot of back then, you have to make sure those colors match what DC Comics wanted them to be. So you'd always be sampling the colors from the palettes to then paint on it. But periodically, it was a good idea to take the image you were painting, move it to the other monitor, just to see how different it looks. Those two monitors were calibrated to display identically, and they never did. There were always some variation. So it was a good way to remind you, you know what? Always take a look at those color values. Always take a look at the sliders so you can see. For instance, if I know that I want a color of red that has a little bit less yellow in it, a bit more magenta, like I want it to be slightly pinkish, and on the screen that I'm painting on, it looks slightly pinkish, that's great. If I move it to the other monitor, it might show it as looking more orange because it might be displaying the yellow a little bit more saturated. In which case, okay, is that my eye that's screwed up? Or is it the monitor? That's when you look at the math. And if you see that the yellow slider is a little bit higher than the magenta slider, it means this is now orange. There's more yellow in it than there is magenta. This isn't red, or it isn't pink. So you have to start, pay attention to it that way. Now that CMYK slider is not 100% accurate either in this instance because I am actually painting this in RGB rather than in CMYK, which is a habit I got into when I got more into doing standalone digital paintings. Basically, it has to do with the number of effects you can add. A lot of the effects you can add in RGB cannot be added into a CMYK painting or in CMYK illustration in the same way in Photoshop. So I just started compensating for that. RGB can seem a bit more vivid on the screen, but will actually print a little bit duller than a CMYK image. But once you've played with that a while, you can get used to the differences. So here, you can see that I'm dealing with, I still have red light coming from the left-hand side of frame onto the jacket and on the pants. It isn't that it's a different type of red light than what's falling on the guitar. Instead, it's the fabric itself is a different color. So that red interacts with it differently, resulting in a different color of red. It still shows that we're primarily dealing with a red light source from the right, from her right, from the left of frame. But it will interact differently with the various items that it lands on. So a very shiny surface, a very clean surface, it might end up looking very bright red, kind of like on much of the guitar. But on her jacket, even though I am dealing with, it is a leather jacket, it probably isn't the shiniest. It's a bit worn out. And the base color skews between black and brown. So we could say like a warm black or a neutral. It will reflect that red light slightly differently. So, depending on the effect that you're wanting to get. But those are good things to think about. That if you're wanting to deal with warm tones, cool tones, if you're wanting to deal with color lights, it isn't just what color of light am I painting onto this? What color will that end up being when it's interacting with different surfaces? Because it'll end up being a different color being cast on the flesh tones, depending on the particular flesh tones you're using on a character. With this character, her flesh tones will actually be quite a bit browner than what they are currently. I just used a base, more or less beige-ish orange flesh tone, but that's just the default color I put down originally. Again, it's the same as the green on her shirt. That green on her shirt isn't actually going to be the color of that shirt when I go to paint it. It's just the color I chose to define that area until I go in and actually start painting it. So when I paint it, it'll be a little bit browner. It'll be a little bit grayer because I want to make sure that I have blue in the flesh tone for when I start adding blue light from one side. I want that blue light to have something to interact with. If there was no blue in the original color and I shine a blue light on it, it'll turn white. I'm not going to get into a discussion about how different colors of light interact with each other. There's a lot of tutorials about that on the internet already. But essentially, when you're playing with light, if you're adding different colors, it actually shifts everything closer to white. If you're removing colors, then it makes the remaining colors more pure. It's the opposite of working with pigment. If you're working with paint, if you add red and blue, you get purple. But if you use a red light and a blue light together, you won't end up necessarily with purple, depending on what the particular tones are. Like if you add, well, let's look at RGB, the type of painting I'm actually doing. The basis of the file itself is RGB. It's dealing with red, green, and blue. If you throw down the same values, the same amount of red and green and blue into the same spot, that spot will be white because you've now filled it with all the possible colors. But if you strip away one of those three colors, you'll end up with a different color entirely. If you strip away two of them, then you'll wind up with just red or just green or just blue. I have the CMYK sliders going because like I said, I work in comics and those are usually done in CMYK, and those are adding pigment. And it's a little bit easier to get your head around working with CMYK because if you add the blue and yellow, you know you're going to get green because that's just how pigment works. Whereas RGB tends to work the opposite of how your brain thinks it's going to work. All right, so the jacket, the sports bra, and the pants have now been painted. Now I'm getting onto these belts. Very similar color to the jacket and the pants, but I want to still separate them from each other a little bit. Oh yeah, I'm going with kind of a purple color for the lips. Again, going with the feel of this lead guitarist. And now getting into painting the shirt, I just picked a relatively dark neutral color, and we'll start painting in purple and red to indicate the red light coming from the left-hand side of frame. And this is going to reflect color, the red coming from the side of frame differently than the pants do, than the belts do, than even the guitar does. It's closest to the guitar, but it actually goes a little bit whiter without having the little tiny spot highlights that the guitar does, because the guitar actually has a shinier surface. So it'll have these little spots that actually go to white, whereas the shirt won't quite ever get that bright. But yeah, always dealing with, when I'm dealing with multiple light sources on an object, I concentrate on the primary one first. So in this case, the warm colors, the reds coming from the left-hand side of frame. And then I'll get into the blue side lights so that I'm not mixing them up too much. And then I'll go in and tweak it afterwards and start seeing where I need to update things, where I need to fix things a bit or change it entirely. But I want to play with those initial patterns as much as possible. When I'm working on one element, I like to get that element as finished as I can before I go on to the next one. It's part of the procedure about part of the way to deal with being very deadline focused. You want to you want to figure out a method and try to use that same method as much as you possibly can. make everything consistent. Not because now I'm working without a deadline. This is all stuff that I'm just doing for me. This is being done as something related to a book project that I'm working on, but it's a book project that I've written. It's not for a publisher. It's just something I'm working on my own. I still like to keep the idea of a deadline in mind so that I don't spend too much time just thinking about it. I at some point have to get down and work on it. But the nice thing about playing with looking at everything as though there's a deadline is once you get it to where you think it's good, now you can step back, take another look at it. Now you've got a bit more time. Now that I put it together the way I think it's supposed to be, should it look like this? Do I need to do anything with it? What can I do to make it better? And basically, I would be at the stage where now I can fix things. Now I can tweak things. But you can't get to the fixing or tweaking stage until you've more or less finished the project. So I still tend to work as though I'm working for a client, even when I'm not. Just adds an extra layer of focus. All right, so now we're getting into painting the flesh tones. And again, I went with a much different color than the beigeish pinkish or the beigeish orange color that she was originally painted, going with much warmer tones, much darker browns. Now this will go a lot lighter than this, but I always start, like everything else, with my darkest color and then start painting in the actual light. You won't see a lot of the red coming from the left, but it'll still be very warm tones, very warm light coming from the left-hand side of the screen, from the left side of the frame. Her skin already has a lot of orange and red in it, so I don't have to emphasize that with the red light. Whereas there's just a lot of red in the shirt and in the guitar, and not a lot of other colors. So it's reflecting that red light very well. Now, when I first working on this, I can see already that I probably went a little too bright with this highlight. The contrast between it and the brown is a little bit too strong. So I'm actually going to be painting in a bit more of a mid-tone at some point to balance that a little bit better. But still, overall keeping a browner tone than I did with the original color selection. This is all being done with the paintbrush. Originally, like everything else, I throw in use the gradient tool to create a basic pattern of light and dark over the whole figure, and then I start going in with the paintbrush to actually add the texture and add the individual colors as I go along. I find doing that initial step of putting an overall gradient, especially on flesh tones, it adds kind of an inner light to the figure. And that works really well with flesh tones because human skin is translucent. You can actually see a surprising way through a human figure, through the skin. So that adds to that sense. I'm not making it look super translucent as though it was just, like a balloon or something, but there's still a slight translucency effect that I'm getting. So a certain inner glow. And here, yeah, I'm already knocking back some of that brighter highlight. So I can put in, I'll still add in a bit more brighter light, but I want to wait until more of the mid-tone, is added into the overall coloring on the figure. Haven't even gotten to any of the blue yet. Still dealing with the warm tones coming from the left side of frame. And I'm always talking about specifying the left of frame. All of this light coming from the left of frame, from her perspective, because she's facing towards us, is coming from her right. So these things can be tricky to explain. I've actually done quite a bit of this over the years. I actually taught art for quite a while, which is why I enjoyed getting into doing Twitch streams a few years ago and doing some YouTube stuff. I actually want to get into more things like this where I'm discussing the illustration that I'm working on a bit more instead of just presenting the process, but actually talking about the process, talking about my decisions as I'm making them while this is happening. Now, as long as this video is about 2.5 hours showing this process, the actual process from the original, breaking down the original sketch on my Samsung tablet to finally completing the coloring on in Photoshop for this illustration took about a total of 13 hours. I do have a couple of videos on my channel where I put in the entire process in real time. There's one where it's a 10-hour video where I did that, and then there's another one where it's I believe 4 individual videos, each about 2 hours long. Didn't want to break it down that way. Those are basically just Twitch streams that I then threw onto YouTube. This is one where I'll just talk about. There's a lot of repetition in the things you're drawing. I don't need to show all of that, but we'll show the vast majority of the decision-making portions in the illustration and talk about those. So I haven't. Back to the discussing the flesh tone here. I am adding in the blue side light, a bit more purple here. I haven't gone to full highlights yet on the skin tone from the left-hand side of the screen. I kind of wanted to put in that opposing color, put in that opposing light first before I finish up all that. In general, skin tones I tend to spend a bit more time on. Because it's a little bit less abstract. Everybody, of all the things you're going to be seeing skin tones the most often in real life. You're going to be recognizing what they are. So I tend to like to try to make them a bit more realistic than some other things. May not always be seeing giant stone statues in the middle of a mall. So I can be a little bit more abstract with those. But yeah, I'll tend to spend a bit more time on the actual painting portion of human skin, depending on what the characters are, or if I'm doing a robot illustration, then it'll be the same there, because you're recognizing it as a character. So that's actually another reason. Isn't just the recognition from the viewer as to what they're looking at. It's also adding more visual interest into the element that is the primary element of the illustration. The primary element of this illustration is the guitarist. So anything to throw more of a story, a story spotlight on her is what I want to be doing. I want to be making it very clear that while she inhabits this world, while she inhabits this environment, the focus of this illustration is her, not the environment. So yeah, even though I'll spend a ton of time creating a super detailed background, fundamentally most of the work is still being done on her. Now we're getting into putting in the actual highlights. So originally when I had used some of these highlight colors on the over the deep shadows, then it was creating an effect I didn't like. So that's why I was knocking back that original painting, making it a bit darker, more of a mid-tone color. So now when I go in with this color, now it looks now it adds a lot more contrast. So it's making the direction of light a lot more specific, brings out particular contours, like picking out the belly button and the belly button ring, how you see it through both the belly button and then right above it. And they actually look different. The way it affects her skin, the way it pushes on her skin is different depending on the actual position of each element of that jewelry. So, yeah, we're getting really close to being done the primary painting and then getting into some of the special effects. And the special effects is where this is going to turn into a bit more of a Ridley Scott kind of a feel. Not necessarily adding in fog effects over top of everything, but it'll be the way that I am changing the texture of the line art behind her, of all the inking behind her. A little bit on her as well, so that she doesn't look completely separated in the background. But we'll get into that in a short bit after the last of these highlights on the skin tones are completed. We're actually getting pretty close to that point. And yeah, just picking out some of the secondary muscle construction, things that I didn't necessarily highlight very much in the original line art, but now I wanted to add in. This is one of the reasons why I will tend to leave a lot of skin tones with not a ton of ink detail, because here's where I have a bit of opportunity to play with some subtler musculature and ways that the human body moves and curves in space. Whereas on the jacket, most of those elements are in the line art. It's a much higher contrast, much more detail can be put in with the line art. With human skin, there tends to be a bit more of a blend. Also, the more line art you add to a figure, the more line art you put into human skin, the older you then end up making that character look. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And that's whether it's on their face or any other part of their body. Because I have seen work where people would not put in a lot of line art on the face because they didn't want the character to look too old, but then they'll add so much extra detail on other parts in the body, and that can still end up making the character look old. It'll give them like a Botox effect, where they've injected Botox in their face to make themselves look younger, but then their arms are still really wrinkly or whatever. So I try to balance that. If I'm not putting in a lot of line art on the face, I won't put on the rest of the body either. But conversely, if the face has a lot of line art, then and a lot of fine detail, I will add all that extra detail into the rest of the skin tone, so that they look universally a bit older, or consistently the same age. But yeah, now just tweaking the polishing up the painting effects here. Fixing any issues I was having earlier. Yeah, we're very close to being done. Oh, I think we're actually, almost done with being with the primary painting here. Flattening out a little bit of the paint texture. Too much paint texture can also add to the age of a character. So there can be a stage where, I like the overall pattern of light and darkness, but now I just want to smooth everything out a little bit. Or make it even more textured, depending on how old the character is supposed to be looking. And let's see. Oh, now the last part is working on the hair. Not a lot to do here. There's very little open areas on the hair for light. Pretty much all those decisions were made in the original line art. So this is just basically to add in a few extra highlights. And then just a touch more contrast. Now, the color choices in the hair do follow the ones on the rest of the figure, where they're warm on the one side, cool on the other, but they are so bright, it's not always so easy to tell. Okay, so now is where I start getting into dealing with background lighting effects. And the way I'm doing that here is the deep background is going to have light cast over the whole thing. So I'm actually using the quick mask tool in Photoshop to select the deep background. So that green you see does not actually exist. It's just a holding area. It's just showing that this is my current selection, so it makes it easier to add and subtract from that selection. In Photoshop, if you've ever if you don't know what I'm talking about, if you've played with Photoshop and you've ever accidentally hit Q, and then you wondered why did everything suddenly turn green? That's that. That's that quick mask. So I have selected that area, and on a separate layer, I am now painting in this blue light over the background. And it's affecting all the line art and all the painting. So this is adding even more depth. So it's pushing that background even further behind that statue. Once I got that completed, I'm now doing the same thing on the statue itself. I'm keeping the original selection. The original selection was the deep background, but I'm adding a selection for the statue. Now I'll do this a few different ways. This particular method is just grabbing the line art and the background color as a selection, creating another layer on top of my previous special effect, and then I'll start painting another blue light source from the top that will push the statue even further back. Okay. I know I'm going to be changing that red right away, but I will come back to that. So the background, that entire environment behind the main character is actually going to be affected by two different colors. In the same way that the character is being affected by a red light to the left of frame and a blue light to the right of frame, the backgrounds, including the statue, are being affected by a blue light source from above and a red light source from below. Remember, one of the ways I'm making, I'm pulling the main character further forward in the frame to keep, to put a bunch of physical distance between her and the rest of the illustration, is by changing the light sources to make it really obvious that she's not being affected by the same light that the statue and the deep background are. So not only are the directions of light in the background different than the light that's falling on the character, the directions of the color of light are also different. So here, and I'll be changing that because I had the layer set to normal instead of screen to make it a little bit more vibrant. You can still see the red light coming from below, not only affecting the background, but affecting the background through the glass panels in that railing. And I'll just play with this a little bit until I get to something that I'm happy with. It's a bit more of a magenta than an actual red. The magenta and purple thing, which is much more of the synthwave retro color style that seems to be coming big, which I'm super happy with because I was a teenager in the 80s and it was everywhere then. So it is fun watching that come back into style. But yeah, playing with both blue light and then the magenta light on top of that. And I tend to do these on different layers so they're easy to play with. I think of doing stuff like this with a dozen or so layers, and how if I had done anything like this on a comic page back at Digital Chameleon, my art director would have had questions because this makes an incredibly large file compared to what we were supposed to be using. Like when you finished a comic book page back in the 90s and early 2000s, every comic book page had to have 3 layers. You could have 4 or 5 depending on if there were special effects being added, glow effects, highlights, things like that. If you had anything more than that, you had to be able to explain yourself because that used up resources. And they were always having to archive old comic pages off of everybody's computer because the hard drives, again, a decent hard drive there was 3 to 4 gigs. And a really good machine had a hard drive with 10 gigs of space. It's not even comparable to anything we're working on right now. I think in total, between all the computers that are in this room right now, and including all the archive space, I probably have in the neighborhood of 25 terabytes of space which is far more than that entire studio had even by the time it closed in 2003. So now the background elements are all done. The background separates enough. I'm quite happy with how that turned out. And I'm adding a series of smaller, bright white highlights onto the guitar. This shows where it's super shiny. And basically anything where it goes to white will also create a little bit of a shine. So it'll be shining the color over the line art. Specifically on the buttons, on some the metal elements on the neck of the guitar. But little things like that separate the texture of the guitar from the texture of the amplifier, because I'm not really doing it on the amplifier. I say that as I'm doing highlights on it, but I'm only doing the highlights on those metal knobs, not on the body of the amplifier. So it's one of the ways that that amplifier ends up being separated. And then once I get those elements that I like, I'm going to put a slight reddish glow over the entire image from the left of frame, which still pushes the foreground elements a little bit further back. So I want her in front of everything. I want her separated from the background, but not separated so far that it looks like she's not even part of the same drawing. If everything in the background is being affected by these colors everywhere, then I want her to have a similar effect. And there is the finished piece. Thank you very much for hanging around, and I will talk to you later.